I was not born into the Imperium the way old hymns pretend, swaddled in banners, kissed by incense, cradled by a mother who dared to smile. I was entered. There is a difference that gnaws at you when you get older, when you start to see the seams in everything, the stitching of rules, the rivets in piety, the dull shine of obedience rubbed smooth by countless hands. My first memory is not of a face, it is of a counter, a slab of stained stone, worn concave by elbows and years, with a brass grill bolted across its width like a prison window. Behind it, a clerk sat in shadow, their features lost in the harsh, directionless glow of lumen strips. I remember the sound before I remember anything else, the constant papery rasp of parchment being sorted, the click of a stamp being raised and lowered, the distant clank of a chain conveyor somewhere deeper in the building. Even the air seemed filed into categories, cold, dry, and tasting faintly of ink, sweat, and disinfectant that never fully conquered the rot. My guardian, if that title can be given to someone who merely kept me fed until I could be assigned, pressed me forward with a hand that smelled of machine grease. The pressure on my shoulder was not comforting, it was directional, like the force that slides a cartridge into a chamber. Next, the clerk said, and it did not sound like a voice meant for conversation. It sounded like an issuance. The administratum hall was full of bodies, and none of them belonged to themselves. People stood in lines that braided together and split apart according to signage nailed high on the walls: citizen registration, labor claims, death certification, reassignment appeals. Each sign was a small promise of attention, and each was a lie. Attention was not what you got here, you got processing. A servo skull drifted above the crowd, its lens eye panning left and right with a tired mechanical patience. Its incense burner sputtered weakly, as though even the machine spirits were weary of blessing this place. The smoke mixed with the scent of wet parchment, the kind of damp that comes from too many human breaths trapped under too little ventilation, and with the copper tang of fear that people don't admit they exhale until they're already drowning in it. The clerk leaned forward. When their face entered the light, I saw the augmetics, lenses where eyes should have been, ringed in dull iron, with tiny apertures that contracted and widened in silent appraisal. Their mouth was real, their cheeks were real, but the eyes were not. The eyes belonged to the ledger. They did not look at me like a child, they looked at me like an entry that had wandered out of its column. Designation? The clerk asked. My guardian gave a name, a family sound, something that had been spoken in kitchens, in narrow sleeping niches, in moments where softness was permitted because no overseer was listening. I remember the name, how could I not? But it is useless to write it now. That syllable set belongs to a person the Imperium has already corrected out of existence. The clerk's lenses whirred softly. They turned their head not toward us, but toward the stacks around them, folders tied with twine-stamped sheets, bound volumes with flaking leather spines. Their hands moved with the familiarity of ritual. It was not hurried, but it was mercilessly efficient, the efficiency of a knife that has cut the same shape of meat 1,000 times and has learned the path of least resistance through muscle and tendon. Name not located, they said at last, and my guardian's hand tightened on my shoulder. Proceeding to provisional classification. The word provisional might sound gentle to someone who hasn't lived under it. It is not. Provisional means you are available to be corrected. The clerk drew a card from beneath the counter, blank except for faint grid lines. They set it on the stone slab and wrote with a stylus that scratched like an insect in panic. I watched their hand move, and I felt, truly felt, the moment my life was being translated from breathing to paperwork. The clerk asked questions. Not the questions people ask when they care what the answers mean. These were questions that fed categories. Birth site? My guardian answered, a hab block sector, level number, corridor code. Words that didn't describe a place as lived in, only as locatable. Parental status? Deceased, my guardian said, as if that were a natural state, as if the dead were just a form of inventory that had gone missing. Known contagions? No. Deviations? My guardian hesitated. The clerk's lenses did not blink. They waited like a trap. No, my guardian said again, faster, and I realized even then, too young to understand much, but old enough to understand fear, that a wrong answer could be a sentence. The clerk stamped the card once. The sound snapped through the air like a lash. The inked imprint was a sigil I did not recognize, but I felt it in my teeth. The stamp was not merely marking paper, it was marking me. A second stamp followed, then a third. With each impact, I felt my small sense of self compress, as though the air was being pumped out of me and replaced with something denser and colder. The crowd's murmur seemed to dim. The hall's distant machinery became louder. The servo skull drifted close enough that I smelled the burnt sweetness of its incense, masking nothing. When the clerk spoke again, they did not use my name. Unit assigned temporary citizen code, they said, and my guardian exhaled. Relief or resignation, I couldn't tell. The clerk slid the card forward under the brass grill, and it came to rest near my hands. I stared at it like it might bite. A string of characters stared back, letters and numbers arranged with the ugly certainty of a prison sentence. The clerk's lenses rotated, narrowing, then widening, as if they were focusing not on me but on the future they were fitting me into. Sign, they said. My guardian produced a stub of graphite and pressed it into my palm. It was too large, too rough. My fingers were clumsy. The graphite smelled faintly of dust and sweat, passed down from countless other hands that had been told to agree. I looked at the card again. There was a line at the bottom, acknowledgement of classification and acceptance of administrative outcomes. I did not understand the phrase, not fully, but I understood acceptance. I understood outcomes the way animals understand weather, something vast and indifferent that arrives whether you pray or not. My guardian leaned close, lips near my ear. Do it, they whispered, not gently, not kindly. Do it and keep your head down. I looked up through the brass grill at the clerk. Their eyes did not meet mine because they did not have human eyes anymore. They had lenses that saw only compliance. In that moment, I had a child's irrational hope that if I refused, if I held the graphite tight and shook my head, someone would notice I was alive, not just a line waiting to be filled, that they would see my fear and pause, that the world would treat me as something other than a problem of record keeping. But the hall behind me pressed forward. The line moved. The servo skull drifted away, uninterested. The clerk's stylus hovered over the next blank card, already preparing to forget me. I understood then, without words, that my refusal would not be a heroic stand. It would be an error. And errors in the Imperium are corrected with methods that do not leave room for lessons learned, so I signed. The graphite squealed on the paper. My hand shook so badly that the mark looked like a dying insect's path. I felt my heartbeat in my fingertips, frantic and small, like something trapped behind glass. The clerk took the card back, flipped it, stamped the reverse. One more sharp impact of authority, sealing my crooked signature beneath the waxless certainty of procedure. Entered, the clerk said. A word that sounded like a door closing. Next. My guardian pulled me away. The crowd swallowed us. The administratum hall receded behind, but the smell followed, ink and damp paper, and the faint sweetness of incense trying to cover a deeper stench of human despair. That night, in the habniche we returned to, my guardian pinned the card above my sleeping slab, as if it were a holy icon. Don't lose it, they warned. This is you. I stared at it in the dim light, watching the characters blur and sharpen as my eyes tired. The code did not change, but my relationship to it did. It began as a label. It became a leash. Even as a child, I felt the chill of it, the sense that my life's end had already been written somewhere, sealed in a vault of paper and wax, that any dream I might have, any hope of choosing my own direction, was merely a clerical inconvenience awaiting correction. I slept beneath the card as if beneath a blade, and in the dark, in the quiet between the distant grind of hive machinery and the muffled prayers of neighbors, I understood the true miracle the Imperium performs every day. Not the forging of weapons, not the raising of cathedrals, not the victories on distant battlefronts. The miracle is this: how easily a living soul can be reduced to ink, and how willingly that ink will later be used to erase the soul entirely. The first time reality was rewritten, it didn't arrive with thunder, or with a prophet's warning, or even with the honest violence of a baton. It arrived the way everything truly lethal arrives in the Imperium, as paperwork, a thin strip of parchment, narrow as a finger bone and just as pale, slid under the door of my bunk cubicle sometime during second shift. I heard it before I saw it, the faint scrape against the metal threshold, like a rat dragging something precious into shadow. The Hablock's vents exhaled their usual breath of warmed dust and chemical damp, and the lumen above my sleeping slab buzzed with its tired insect song, flickering in the same rhythm it always did. 3 steady pulses, 1 stutter, then the dim glow of institutional mercy. I should have left the paper where it lay. Everyone learns that lesson eventually. If something is meant for you, it will find you again, and if it isn't, touching it only makes it your problem. But curiosity is a form of hunger, and hunger is my earliest creed. I rose barefoot onto the cold grated floor, joints stiff from a day spent hunched over sorting bins in a counting annex, and bent down to take the notice between thumb and forefinger. The parchment was damp, not wet exactly, just clammy, as if it had been carried in a mouth. A red wax seal clung to one end, impressed with a sigil I recognized from the registration hall, the same administrative mark that had swallowed my name years ago, the same indifferent authority made tactile. The seal smelled faintly of incense and heated resin, and underneath that, a sharper odor like old blood baked into cloth. The text was printed in clean, uniform script. No human hand, no tremor, no doubt. Machine-perfect letters, so confident they seemed to accuse the reader of weakness for possessing a pulse. I read it once, then again, because the first time my mind refused to accept the shapes of the words. Correction notice, incident disposition update subject witnessed accident, manufacturum conveyance junction 19B status. Incident did not occur. Personnel disposition. Previously listed casualties reclassified as misreported labor transfers. Witness statement updated and archived. Compliance required. Acknowledge receipt. I remember the taste that rose in my mouth as I read. Metal, like I'd been sucking on coins to calm myself. My tongue ran along my teeth and found them gritty, as if my own body was trying to grind away what I'd just learned. Because I had witnessed the accident. I had stood there only a few days earlier during an overtime pass through the lower manufacturing corridors, when the overhead chain hoist snapped, when the pulley screamed, when the load, a crate of pressed alloy ingots stamped with the Aquila, fell like a dropped monument. I had heard the impact. That sound doesn't fade. It's not a single noise. It's a whole brief symphony of catastrophe. The initial crash, the wet crunch of something soft becoming flat, the secondary rattling of bolts, the squeal of a conveyor belt fighting to keep moving as if production itself could outrun death. I had smelled hot oil atomizing in the air, felt the tremor through the soles of my boots, watched vapor rise where blood met a heated floor panel. I had seen bodies, men and women from my own shift cohort, reduced to shapes that no longer fit the human templates the shrine posters insisted we were made in. And now the Imperium had sent me a notice that, by the clerical power of proper formatting, declared the accident did not occur. The first strange thing was not the lie. Lies are common. Everyone in Hive City knows that truth is a luxury reserved for the powerful. The strange thing was the audacity of the lie, its quiet certainty, its insistence that the world itself should simply bend to match the filing system. I sat on the edge of my sleeping slab with the notice in my hands, and in the humming half-dark, I stared at it until the letters began to blur. A single sheet of paper was trying to erase a sound that still rang in my bones. The next day, the hive went on as if nothing had happened. That was the second strange thing, how easily a city of billions can accept an edit. The corridors were still crowded with bent backs and hollow cheeks. The shift horns still wailed at their appointed hours. The air still tasted of recycled breath and industrial ash. Even the shrine cant still bled through tinny speakers in the transit tunnels, monotone prayers reminding us that obedience is salvation, that doubt is contamination, that the Emperor sees our labor even if no one else does. But I began to notice absences like missing teeth. At mess, the bench where Carter used to sit, Carter with the laugh that always sounded like she was choking on soot, was empty. I looked at the soup vats and remembered her hands slipping, the ladle splashing, her muttered apology to the ration overseer. No one else mentioned her. When I tried, the words came out wrong. "Where's Carter?" I asked a man across from me. My voice sounded too loud, too alive. He frowned as if I'd asked about something obscene. "Transferred," he said, and shoved a spoonful of grey slurry into his mouth with the urgency of someone who believes hunger is a sin. "Transferred where?" He glanced around, eyes darting to the wall-picked casters, to the ceiling vents, to the servo skull hovering near the ration counter. "Lower levels," he murmured. "Or off-sector. Don't know. Don't ask. Don't ask." The hive's real litany. Later, in the counting annex, a servitor rolled past my station, pushing a cart stacked with fresh forms. It moved in jerky increments, its augmetic legs squeaking, its jaw slack with the slackness of the dead. A strip of parchment had been stapled to its chest plate like a devotional scroll, "Authorized carrier, do not obstruct." The servitor's smell preceded it, disinfectant, stale oil, and something underneath, faint and sour, like meat left too long in a warm room. As it passed, the papers on its cart fluttered. I caught glimpses of headings, revision, amendment, correction. Each sheet seemed to hum with the same cold authority as the notice in my hands. The fear came back in my mouth, metallic coin taste, so strong I swallowed hard and nearly gagged. I realized then that the correction notice was not an isolated act, it was a method. The Imperium did not merely punish, it edited. It did not merely kill, it reclassified. It did not merely hide mistakes. It declared mistakes impossible, then demanded reality follow. I carried my own notice folded into my sleeve like contraband. It felt heavier than it should have. Sometimes I would touch it through the fabric just to confirm it was real, and every time I did, my skin prickled as if I were handling a live wire. That night, I did what I should never have done, I wrote. Not an official form, those have boxes, those have lines that guide your thoughts into approved shapes. I wrote on scrap packaging paper stolen from the annex, using a dulled stylus I'd hidden under my sleeping slab. I wrote in cramped letters, pressing hard enough that the paper nearly tore. I wrote the names of the dead the way I remembered them. I wrote the sound of the hoist snapping. I wrote the smell of hot oil and blood on heat. I wrote the way the foreman had yelled for the line to keep moving, even as men screamed. I wrote because I was terrified that if I didn't, the correction notice would seep into my skull and overwrite the truth there too. When I finished, my wrist ached, and my fingertips were black with graphite. The words looked wrong on the paper, too personal, too fragile. They felt like heresy, like a confession waiting to be punished. I folded the sheet into a tight square and hid it inside a crack in the wall panel behind my bunk, prying loose a rivet with my nail. The metal was cold and slightly wet, as if the hab block itself sweated with the burden of all it contained. Afterward, I lay down and listened to the hive's noises, the distant rumble of freight lifts, the hiss of vents, the occasional scream muffled by walls thick with grime, the soft, constant shuffle of countless lives being moved from place to place like tokens on a board none of us could see. Everything sounded the same as it always had. But I felt, deep in my ribs, beneath hunger and fatigue and the daily ache of survival, that the world's spine had shifted a fraction. Something had been repositioned by unseen hands. Not a dramatic break, just a subtle adjustment, like a clerk straightening a stack of papers until the edges align. And I understood something that made my stomach turn cold. If the Imperium could rewrite an accident out of existence, it could rewrite anything. A death, a crime, a prayer, a person. It could rewrite me. In the dark, I kept tasting metal, and I began to fear not only what they might do to my body, but what they might do to my memories. I had always believed my thoughts were mine, the last small refuge in a hive that owned my hours and my blood. Now I knew better. The notice had told me, in its polite and perfect language, that the accident did not occur. And the most horrifying thing was this: the city was already behaving as if it were true. They came for me on a workday, because the Imperium prefers its cruelty to be punctual. The shift horn had barely died in the ducts when the Hab block Vox chimed my code, my temporary citizen code that had long ago ceased to feel temporary. The sound was flat, administered, and without any inflection that could be mistaken for concern. A good voice for summoning, a voice that made compliance feel like gravity. Unit, the Vox recited, and I felt the syllables land on me like fingers. Report to Sub-Annex 12. Corridor Cinder, Level 17, time allotment immediate. No reason, no explanation. The administratum does not explain, it instructs. You are not entitled to understanding. Understanding is a luxury like clean water or unbroken sleep. I tucked the scrap of paper with my secret writing deeper into the wall crack behind my bunk, pressing the panel until it clicked back into place. I tried not to look at it too long, as if looking would make it glow through the metal. My hands trembled anyway. That taste returned. Metal coins held too long under the tongue, and I swallowed it with stale air. On the corridor walk I passed the usual pilgrimage posters glued crooked to the walls, each one promising absolution through labor, ventilation grates weeping condensation like sick eyes, the slow shamble of people wearing their exhaustion as uniformly as their gray work rags. Somewhere above, a freight elevator groaned, cables singing like strained tendons. Somewhere below, a sump pump choked and restarted, as if even the machine spirit had learned the rhythm of despair. No one spoke to me, no one looked at me for long. In a hive city, attention is a kind of contagion. If authority notice you, it might spread to the ones you love, the ones you share air with, the ones whose names, real names, still cling to you like warmth. So people avert their eyes as a form of prayer. Sub-Annex 12 was not marked by a sign so much as by the smell. The air thickened as I approached, heavy with parchment dust, candle smoke, and a chemical sweetness that reminded me of the disinfectant used in the Hab block infirmary after a workplace mauling. Old iron, old ink, and that ever-present incense trying to convince you that holiness could be manufactured in vats and poured down corridors. A pair of door servitors stood at the entrance like statues of the condemned, their bodies plated, their hands built into locking mechanisms. Their faces were shaved smooth and expressionless, eyes replaced by dull glass. They did not acknowledge me as I approached, but a lens above the door rotated, focusing, and a small click sounded, like a form being stamped. The door parted on hydraulic sighs. Inside, the lumen strips buzzed in an uneven rhythm that made my head ache. The room was narrow and longer than it had any right to be, like a throat designed for swallowing. Walls of grey metal, pitted and scarred, were lined with shelving stuffed with binders, scroll tubes and stacked paper bundles tied in twine. Everywhere, the red of wax seals. Everywhere, the smell of damp paper and old sweat. It was less a room than a filing system with enough space carved out to place a human being inside. At the far end sat a man, or something that had once been a man, at a desk whose surface was scarred by decades of stamps and stylus cuts. He wore the dull robe of an administratum functionary, but his sleeves were reinforced with leather, as if he expected to wrestle. His head was bare and shining with perspiration despite the cold air. A steel collar ringed his throat, and a cable ran from it into the desk like a leash into a kennel. He did not rise. He did not greet me. He lifted one finger, not pointing at a chair, but indicating the square of floor in front of the desk where I was to stand. I stood. "Audit," he said. The word was almost gentle, like a physician naming an operation, not an accusation. I tried to breathe quietly. I tried to keep my hands at my sides instead of clenched, because clenched hands look like defiance. Defiance attracts attention. Attention invites correction. The functionary's eyes were human, but there was no warmth in them. They were the eyes of a man who had stared at too many documents to remember faces. On the desk to his right sat a small brass censer, its coals glowing under a cage of sacred metal. Incense burned lazily, sweet and thick, and the smoke curled around the desk in slow ribbons that made the air feel heavier with every breath. On his left sat a servo quill rig, an articulated arm with multiple nibs that twitched as if eager. It hovered above a sheet already laid out, lines already printed, boxes already waiting. The quill would translate whatever I said into the format the Imperium could digest. And behind him, half in shadow, stood a second figure, silent, arms folded across a chest plate of polished black. A shock baton hung at their belt. Their face was hidden by a visor. Their stance was casual in the way only people with permission to hurt others can be casual. "State your designation," the functionary said. I spoke my code. He nodded as if confirming a measurement. "You received a correction notice." "Yes." "Recite it." My throat tightened, but I recited it word for word because the notice had burned itself into me. As I spoke the phrase "incident did not occur," the metal taste sharpened and I felt my stomach twist, as if my body wanted to reject the sentence like poisoned food. The functionary made a tiny hand gesture. The servo quill scratched rapidly. The sound was unbearable, fast, dry, and constant, like insects gnawing through wood. I watched the quill write and felt a sick certainty. This was the real event, not the accident, not the bodies. This, the translation of my fear into approved lines. "Now," the functionary said, "describe the incident." My mind stuttered. The world tilted slightly as if the floor had shifted under me. Describe the incident that did not occur. It was like being asked to draw a shape that the rules insisted was impossible. I began anyway. I described the hoist, the snap, the falling crate, the sound. The functionary listened without expression, his gaze fixed not on my face but on the quill's movement. When I said the names, Carter, Jessen, Old Rull with his missing fingers, he lifted his hand sharply. "Names are irrelevant," he said. "Use unit designations." "I don't know their full designations," I admitted. The black armored figure shifted slightly. The leather of their glove creaked. The functionary's tone remained calm. "Then omit," I continued. "I described blood on heat. I described the foreman's shouting. I described the line restarting while people still screamed." The servo quill wrote it all down, and I felt something inside me recoil at the neatness of it. How the words became clean the moment they were written. How the horror was pressed flat into orderly sentences. When I finished, I stood there panting softly, as if I'd been running though I had not moved at all. The functionary tapped the paper twice with a finger. "Recite it again," he said. My heart lurched. "Again?" "Audit requires consistency." I began again, slower. The second telling felt wrong, not because it differed, but because it forced my mind to walk the same path twice, treading down the grass of memory into a narrower trail. My images began to simplify. Details slipped away, not from forgetting, but from the pressure to be repeatable. Horror is vivid the first time. Bureaucracy drains color from it, demands it be reproducible like a manufacturing part. When I finished the second recitation, he did not pause. Again, my mouth went dry. I could smell the incense more strongly now, and beneath it, the sour tang of my own sweat. The lumen strips buzzed louder, the room felt smaller. The shelves full of binders seemed to lean inward, as if curious to see what shape my memory would be beaten into. I recited again and again. Somewhere between the fourth and fifth time, I noticed something strange. The functionary sheet already contained phrases I had not spoken yet. My eyes snagged on a line while the quill paused to switch nibs. Witness observed no fatalities. Another, witness reports minor equipment malfunction. My voice faltered. The functionary's gaze finally lifted to my face. Continue. That isn't what I said, I whispered, and the whisper sounded childish in that room, like a prayer made by someone who doesn't understand the cost of praying incorrectly. His expression did not change. It is what you will have said. The black armored figure moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just one step forward, enough that the air seemed to tighten. I saw them die, I said, and my voice rose despite myself. There were bodies. The baton cracked into my ribs before I even finished. A burst of white pain and electric heat, sharp enough that my knees buckled. I gasped and tasted copper, real copper now, not imagined. My mouth filled with saliva, bitter and thick. The figure did not hit me again. They didn't need to. Pain is not meant to kill you here. It is meant to train you. The functionary waited until my breathing steadied into shallow gulps. Audit, he repeated, as if reminding me. Not accusation. I clutched my side with one hand, fingers trembling. My eyes watered. The room swam. The quill scratched on, unconcerned. Now, the functionary said softly, you will answer questions to reconcile your recollection with archive truth. He slid a folder across the desk, turning it so I could see. It was thick, stuffed with papers. My designation was printed on the cover in block letters. Beneath it was my signature. I stared at it, stunned. My signature, my hand's crooked mark, appeared at the bottom of multiple statements in the folder. Statements I had never made. I leaned forward, forgetting caution. The functionary did not stop me. I saw lines of text, paragraph after paragraph, all stamped and sealed, describing the incident as a minor disruption, describing me as having observed no fatalities, describing the supposed casualties as having been reassigned to labor transfer with no injury. My signature was there, repeated. The same trembling mark I'd made years ago in the registration hall, copied, replicated, pressed like a stamp itself. Something inside me went hollow. How? I began. The functionary's gaze was almost pitying, but not for me, for the inconvenience of my confusion. The archive is consistent, he said. You are inconsistent. The purpose of audit is to resolve that discrepancy. He began asking questions, rapid and precise. Was the hoist mechanism inspected prior? I hesitated. I did not know. The baton tapped my shoulder lightly, only a reminder. Answer with approved uncertainty, the functionary said. Options are on the form. I looked down and saw a printed list, unknown due to limited access. Unable to confirm. Outside witness competence. I chose one. My voice sounded distant as I spoke it, like I was hearing myself through a wall. More questions. Each one fenced my memory in. Each answer was guided by pre-written options. My lived experience was being poured into a mold, and whatever didn't fit was shaved off. At some point, my resistance stopped looking like bravery and started looking like stupidity. The baton's earlier strike still burned in my ribs with every breath. The black armored figure's silence was heavier than speech. The quill's constant scratching drilled into my skull until I felt I would confess to anything just to make it stop. So I began to comply. I repeated their phrases. I accepted their options. I allowed my memories to be indexed, sanitized, made useful. When it was done, the functionary placed the final sheet on the desk and indicated the signature line. "Sign," he said. My hand shook so hard I could barely hold the stylus. The signature I scrawled looked less like a name and more like a wound. The functionary stamped it immediately, the impact loud in the narrow room. Then he stamped it again. Then he slid the paper into the folder as if tucking away a corpse. "You are reconciled," he said. "Your prior inconsistency has been corrected." I stood there dizzy with pain and something worse than pain, the sensation that a piece of me had been peeled away and filed. As I turned to leave, the functionary spoke once more, almost conversational. "Understand this, unit. The Imperium does not debate witnesses. It does not bargain with recollection. It maintains continuity. You will be grateful for the stability the archive provides." Stability. Outside the annex, the corridor air tasted thin and cold. The hive's machinery rumbled on. People moved in lines. A distant hymn droned from a speaker, praising duty and denouncing doubt. I walked back to my bunk cubicle with my ribs aching and my mind buzzing. And as I passed the same wall posters and the same vent grates, I felt an awful realization settle in. I could still remember the accident, blood, heat, screams, but now those memories felt unofficial, like contraband inside my skull. I reached my bunk and immediately checked the wall crack where I'd hidden my secret writing. My fingers pried at the panel, heart hammering. The crack was empty. No scrap paper, no cramped confession, nothing. Only bare metal and a faint smear of graphite dust, as if my truth had been rubbed away. I sat down hard on the slab, breathing shallowly. My side throbbed where the baton had kissed me into obedience. The lumen strip flickered above, its buzzing now sounding like laughter. And in that moment, I understood the true horror of the audit. Not that they could force me to sign a lie, but that they could reach into my life, into the physical hiding place of my own words, and remove them without leaving a trace, as if they had done it before, as if they would do it again, as if my thoughts were not mine at all, merely a draft waiting for approval. They call it reconciliation, the way a priest calls a knife mercy. After the audit, I tried to become the kind of citizen the hive rewards, invisible, efficient, silent. I walked with my gaze lowered. I answered only what was asked, and I learned to make my voice flat, like a printed form. The absence of my hidden scrap, the little cramped rectangle of truth I had wedged behind the wall panel, left a draft in my mind. I would wake in the middle of my rationed sleep reaching for it, fingers scrabbling at cold metal, and each time I found nothing, my stomach tightened as if expecting a blow. In the counting annex, the bins kept coming. Tall stacks of production tallies, requisition confirmations, shipment manifests that smelled of wax and hands. The paper was always damp, as if it absorbed the humidity of human breath and refused to let it go. My job was to sort them by seal, by stamp, by minute variations in header glyphs that meant everything to the machine and nothing to the living. The quills scratched, the stamps struck. The servo carts rolled past with their soft squeal of wheels on grit. Then, without announcement, without a posted notice, without any of the theater that honest change requires, my shift was altered. One day the horn sounded at third bell as always. The next day it sounded at second bell, and the work gangs were assigned new corridors, new routes, new quotas. The foreman read from a slate in a voice that tried to sound bored, but the muscles in his jaw jumped as he spoke. "Updated allocation," he said. "Output increase mandated. Absences do not reduce expectations. Failure to meet quota will be handled by disciplinary reconciliation." Absences, we all felt them. Those missing teeth in the crowd, more keenly now. The line for nutrient slurry was shorter. The transit tunnels were less pressed. The hab blocks' communal wash spigots had less competition. and the water still came out the same color of rust and old bone. Bodies vanished, and the hive did not mourn. The hive recalculated. Production did not merely continue, production climbed. At first I assumed the missing was simply transferred, the way the correction notice insisted. I wanted to believe in that clean narrative because believing made survival easier. But the manufacturum does not have mercy in its schedule. It does not grant time for clean disappearances. It consumes people like fuel, and it leaves residue. I smelled the residue before I understood it. It began in the stairwells. A faint sweetness, cloying and wrong, threaded through the usual hive odors of oil and mildew. Then it was in the corridors, outside the annex, drifting in from vents that hissed and shuddered as they pushed stale air through metal lungs. The smell reminded me of the infirmary after a workplace mauling, disinfectant poured over open flesh, a clean scent trying too hard to conquer something that could not be cleaned. I started to notice other things. Workers returning from lower levels with red-rimmed eyes, faces pale beneath grime, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Servitors wheeling sealed bins stamped with hazard sigils, their wheels leaving faint wet tracks on the floor that glistened under lumen light. A new hymn playing on the vox lines between shifts, slower, more solemn, praising the sanctity of material reclamation and the virtue of nothing wasted. The Imperium's greatest prayer is efficiency. I tried to ignore it. I told myself the smell was chemical runoff. I told myself the tracks were coolant leaks. I told myself the hymn was just another devotional cycle. But after the audit, my mind had learned a new kind of fear. Not fear of being killed, but fear of being corrected. Fear that what I perceived would be judged inconsistent with archived truth, and therefore treated as contamination. Still, curiosity is hunger, and hunger always leads you into places you shouldn't go. It happened on a double shift when the counting annex ran short-staffed, another absence unspoken, and the foreman ordered me to deliver a crate of tallies to a junction I'd never been assigned. The route took me deeper into the manufacturum's underchannels, past levels where the walls sweated black condensation and the floor vibrated with the constant thrum of machines too large to see. The air grew warmer, then wetter. The smell thickened until it coated the inside of my throat. Disinfectant, hot oil, incense, heavy, choking, the kind burned in great quantities to cover the smell of something the faithful should not have to acknowledge. Under it all, a raw, meaty tang like butcher shops I'd glimpsed once in the upper market levels, where protein was still sold in shapes that suggested it came from animals and not from vats. I followed the corridor signs, painted arrows and stamped metal plates, until I reached a hatchway I did not recognize. It was sealed with red wax in 3 places. The wax seals were official, impressed with the cog-toothed sigil of manufacturum authority, and a second mark that made my stomach clench, an administratum stamp, neat and absolute. A warning placard hung beside the hatch. Reprocessing hall. Authorized personnel only, labor asset reconciliation in progress. Do not enter without dispensation. I should have turned back. I should have delivered my crate and forgotten the hatch existed. But my hands were already sweating on the tally crate's handles, and that metallic coin taste surged again, sharp enough to make my eyes water. The words reconciliation and asset sat on that placard like fat insects. Something inside me whispered, this is where they went. Not transferred, not reassigned, not missing, reconciled. I looked up and down the corridor, no one. Just the distant grind of conveyors and the occasional hiss of steam bleeding from pipes. A servo skull drifted past the far junction, its lens eye sweeping the corridor, then turning away. The lumen strip above the hatch flickered, as if blinking. I set the tally crate down softly and pressed my ear to the hatch. At first, only machinery. Then a sound, muffled, rhythmic, wet. A human voice, far away but unmistakable in its cadence. Not a prayer, a scream. My fingers found the hatch's side latch almost without instruction, as if my body remembered how to open doors even when my mind begged it not to. The latch was warm, slick from frequent handling. I slid it aside, and the hatch gave with a reluctant groan, the seals cracking with faint snaps like knuckles being broken. The door swung inward. Heat washed over me. Not the dry heat of furnaces, but the humid heat of bodies packed too close together. The air was thick with incense and chemical spray, and it carried a fine mist that clung to my skin. My eyes stung immediately, tears rising without permission. The hall beyond was vast, too vast for the corridor system it was embedded in. It felt like a space carved out of the hive's belly. Catwalks crisscrossed overhead, their railings draped in prayer strips and warning banners. Below, the floor was segmented into stations, each lit by harsh white lumens that made everything look bleached and surgical. And everywhere there were frames, metal rigs shaped like cruciform restraints, bolted to the deck in rows. In each frame a human being, some conscious, some limp, strapped in with thick bands of leather and wire. Their clothes were stripped away or cut open. Their skin shone with sweat and antiseptic. Some had tags pinned to their chests, wax-sealed slips of parchment with codes and stamped dispositions. Men and women from my hab block, from my shift line. Faces I recognized beneath grime, beneath swelling, beneath the glaze of shock. Carter's laugh was gone, but her mouth was still there, open, pulling soundlessly at the air, eyes rolled upward as if trying to see a sky she'd never been allowed. A line of scribes moved between the frames like morticians. They wore ink-stained robes and respirator masks, and each carried a slate and a stamp. They did not look at the bodies as people. They looked at them as items requiring closure. At the far end of the hall, a dais rose beneath a hanging cog-shaped shrine. Candles burned in metal cages, their wax drippings forming stalactites. A priest of the manufactorum, robed face hidden behind a metal respirator fashioned like a skull, stood at a lectern reading from a thick ledger. His voice carried through vox grills mounted along the walls, amplified into a solemn monotone that turned cruelty into liturgy. By decree of sector production mandate, he intoned, labor assets deemed non-compliant, defective, or surplus are hereby reconciled with the needs of the manufactorum. Waste is heresy, inefficiency is sin. Flesh is a resource, bone is a resource, nerve is a resource. Nothing is to be lost to disorder. At each station, surgical servitors waited, machines shaped like men, their arms replaced by saws, drills, clamps, injectors. Their eyes were dead lenses, their mouths were slack. Some wore stained aprons, as if to mimic old-world butchers. They moved with terrifying gentleness. A scribe stepped to the frame nearest me, where a man thrashed weakly, wrists chafed raw by restraints. Unit designation, the scribe said, reading from the tag. Disposition, reassignment to servitor grade function salvage. Consent, administratively assumed. The man's eyes found the scribe wide with pleading. Please, he rasped. Please, The scribe stamped the slate without looking up, vocalization irrelevant. A servitor leaned in, a needle slid into the man's neck with a soft hiss, and his plea dissolved into a gurgle. His body went slack. The servitor's sore arm whirred once, a brief mechanical purr like a content animal, and the smell of cauterized meat surged. I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. My stomach heaved. I tasted bile and incense. This was the missing. This was the quota. This was how the Imperium made absence into output, by converting people into parts, by turning screams into silence and filing the result under efficiency. A scribe noticed me. It wasn't dramatic, just a slight pause in their movement, a subtle shift of head. Their mask turned toward the hatchway where I stood frozen. For one heartbeat I expected alarm. I expected guards. I expected immediate correction. Instead, the scribe merely raised a hand and pointed, not at me, but at the crate of tallies beside the door. "Delivery," they said through their mask, voice muffled. "Set it by intake station. Do not obstruct workflow." My mind refused to process the instruction, "Do not obstruct workflow," as if I was simply another piece of logistics wandering into place. I stumbled forward, legs stiff as if my joints had been replaced with cheap augmetics. Every step brought the smells stronger, the sounds louder, the soft sobbing of someone too shocked to scream, the wet cough of a man whose lungs were filling, the steady scratch of quills recording outcomes while bodies were dismantled. I carried the crate to an intake station, an open desk where a clerk sat amid stacks of paper, hands moving with inhuman speed. The clerk did not look up as I set the crate down. Their stamp struck repeatedly, accepted, accepted, accepted. The sound blended with distant screams like percussion. "Sign receipt," the clerk said. I stared at the paper they slid forward. My hands trembled. The signature line waited like a trap. On the form's header I saw the phrase, "Labor Asset Reconciliation." Material intake. My throat tightened. My ribs ached, remembering the baton's lesson. My eyes burned from incense and horror. Behind me, a woman began to scream, a high animal sound, and a servitor's injector hissed to silence her. I signed. Of course I signed. My hand shook, my mark crooked, but I signed because the forms allowed no other ending in that moment. Refusal would not save the people strapped to frames. Refusal would merely add one more frame to the row. The clerk stamped my signature immediately, sealing it beneath authority. When I turned to leave, I caught Carter's eye, just for a second, one flicker of recognition through the haze of drugs and terror. Her lips moved, no sound came out, but I saw the shape of it. My name, my real name, the name the ledger had swallowed. It struck me like a physical blow. My knees went weak. For a heartbeat I felt the old warmth of being known, and then it was gone, drowned beneath incense and procedure, and the relentless hum of saws. I fled, back through the hatch, back into the corridor where the air was cold and dry and still foul, but not that foul. I shoved the door closed, smearing cracked wax seals with my palm. My skin felt greasy with mist. My clothes clung damp against my back. My ears rang with the memory of screams. I walked fast, then faster, then nearly ran, boots slipping slightly on the grimy floor. Every shadow looked like a scribe. Every distant footstep sounded like a baton being drawn. My mouth filled with that metallic taste again, so strong it felt like my teeth were made of copper. When I reached my bunk cubicle, I locked the door and slid down against it, shaking. I wanted to cry, but even tears felt dangerous, evidence of inconsistency, proof that something had happened that was not supposed to. I pressed my forehead to the metal and breathed through my nose, tasting incense trapped in my sinuses. I told myself I would survive by staying silent. But now I understood what silence truly was in the Imperium. It wasn't neutrality, it wasn't safety. It was cooperation. It was a signature on an unseen page, an acceptance stamp struck over someone else's blood. Somewhere deep in the hive, the reconciliation hall continued its work, turning bodies into resources. Somewhere, scribes read out revised dispositions with devotional calm. Somewhere, a ledger filled with neat lines grew thicker, heavier, more complete. And I, who had once believed truth could be hidden in a wall crack, sat in my bunk with my hands still smelling faintly of disinfectant and hot meat, realizing the outcome had never been mine to watch. It had always been mine to sign. They marched us to the shrine precinct as if it were a privilege, and perhaps to some it was. The hive teaches you early that any place with clean stone and steady candles must be holy, because it is not for you. The shrine was carved into an old transit interchange where trains no longer ran, an intersection of dead rails and living bodies, its vaulted ceiling lost in soot darkness, its pillars wrapped in iron bands like penitent wrists. We walked in rows under the gaze of an icon too large to be intimate, a gilded aquila with wings spread wide, its metal feathers chipped, its breastplate hammered over old dents. Chains of votive lanterns hung from its talons, each lantern a weak star swaying in the stale air. The light did not warm. It only revealed faces grey with fatigue, eyes rimmed red, lips cracked from ration salt. The floor was slick with wax and old knee blood, polished by centuries of devotion and punishment until it shone like a bruise. The air tasted of ash and sanctified rot. That was the first thing that struck me, how the shrine smelled less like heaven and more like a tomb made respectable. Incense burned in ranks, not in bowls but in small cage-like censers bolted to the walls at regular intervals, a grid of smoke meant to control the breathing of the faithful. Under the sweetness was the sourness of too many bodies pressed close, and beneath that, the faint animal tang of candles made from tallow that had once been something else. Every breath felt like swallowing a prayer you didn't choose. They made us kneel, not because we needed humility — humility is the default state of the hungry — but because kneeling puts your eyes where they want them, downward, submissive, focused on the floor, on your own hands, on the smallness of your existence, and because when your knees ache and your muscles cramp, your thoughts become simpler. Pain is a tool of administration. Pain makes minds easier to file. I was placed between two workers from my old shift line. One trembled constantly, not from cold, but from something inside him that would not settle. The other smelled faintly of disinfectant and hot oil, and I had to fight the urge to gag, because the scent dragged me back to that hall of frames, to Carter's eyes finding mine through drug haze and terror. I kept my gaze down. I tried to make my mind a blank form. A bell rang from somewhere near the altar. Not a bright bell, no joy lived in this sound, just a heavy iron clang that made the bones in my teeth vibrate. The murmuring crowd stilled in an instant, the way vermin freeze when a shadow passes overhead. Then the confessor spoke. His voice came through vox grills hidden in the pillars, amplified so it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a voice trained to be listened to, deep, slow, and edged with the authority of someone who believed absolutely in his right to define reality. "Children of the Imperium," he intoned, "the archive is the spine of civilization. Without record, there is only chaos. Without continuity, there is only heresy." I dared to lift my eyes just enough to see him. He stood on a raised dais behind a lectern carved with scripture and stamped with seals. His robe was layered, heavy with embroidered sigils that glinted under candlelight, each stitch a declaration of sanctioned power. His face was mostly hidden behind a rebreather mask fashioned into the likeness of a skull, tubes running from its jaw into the robe's folds, as if he inhaled sanctity and exhaled law. In one hand he held a Crozius-like staff capped with a small icon of the Emperor, and in the other a thick ledger bound in black hide. The ledger was enormous. It looked less like a book and more like a weapon. "Truth," the confessor continued, "is not what the eye believes it sees. Truth is what endures in the archive. Truth is what is sealed. Truth is what is approved." A murmur rippled through the kneeling crowd. Agreement, fear, relief. Approval is a narcotic in the hive. Being told you are correct, even when you are suffering, is the closest many ever come to comfort. I felt my stomach tighten. My ribs still ached faintly from the audit baton, and my skin crawled with the memory of mist and saws and scribes reading dispositions. I tried to keep my face blank. The shrine was full of watchers, robed acolytes, silent enforcers in black carapace, servo skulls drifting like fat insects above the congregation. Their lenses drank in faces, catalogued reactions, compiled risk. The confessor opened the ledger. Pages whispered as they turned, thick parchment sliding against thick parchment. It sounded like 1,000 small doors closing. Today, he said, we perform an act of mercy, the purification of narrative, the cleansing of contradiction, the excision of corruption from the communal memory. My mouth filled with that metallic taste again. I had the sudden, irrational urge to flee, to stand, to run, to smash my way through bodies and wax and chains. But there is nowhere to run in the Imperium. There is only different rooms where obedience is demanded in different languages. They called names. Not names like mine had once been, kitchen names, whispered names, names spoken with affection. These were designations, codes, workforce identifiers. Each was read in a monotone by a scribe standing beside the confessor, the scribe's voice flat and precise as a stamping machine. Unit designation, the scribe said, and my blood went cold as my own code followed, ringing out through vox grills as if the shrine itself had spoken it. I felt every eye shift, not to look at me, no one dares to look too directly, but to register my presence. The air seemed to tighten around my throat. Stand, an enforcer hissed behind us. I rose with the others in my group, knees protesting, wax slick under my boots. My legs felt weak, not from fatigue, but from dread so heavy it made my bones feel porous. We were herded forward to a marked strip on the shrine floor, a line inlaid with brass, worn dull by countless pairs of feet. The strip separated the congregation from the dais like a border between citizen and evidence. Witnesses, the confessor proclaimed, have been found inconsistent. His skull mask turned toward us. I could not see his eyes, but I felt his gaze anyway, an institutional gaze, not personal, a gaze that did not care what I had lived through, a gaze that cared only whether my memories fit. The Imperium does not punish confusion, he said, and I almost laughed at the lie, a bitter sound trapped behind my teeth. It corrects it, it guides it, it offers truth to those burdened by error. A scribe produced a stack of parchments, each one wax-sealed. They were passed down the line to other scribes, who distributed them to us like communion. When the parchment reached my hands, I flinched at the warmth of the seal, as if it had been freshly pressed. The wax smelled of incense and heated resin, and beneath it, faintly, the same sharp odor I had smelled on my correction notice, old blood in cloth. The sheet was titled in bold script, Statement of Witness, purified version. My stomach lurched. Read, the confessor commanded. I looked down and saw my life rewritten in neat paragraphs. The accident that did not occur, was described as a minor equipment malfunction resulting in no fatalities, no injuries requiring significant Medicaid intervention, and no disruption to production beyond acceptable tolerances. The missing workers were listed as successfully transferred to alternate labor allocations with full compliance and gratitude. Gratitude. My hands shook. The paper blurred as my eyes stung. I could hear the manufacturum hall in my head, the wet screams, the hiss of injectors, the whir of saws. I could see Carter's mouth forming my name, a name that was not printed anywhere on this page. No, I whispered before I could stop myself. It was barely a sound, a breath caught in the throat, but in the shrine even a whisper is loud. The enforcer behind me snapped their baton against the back of my knee. Pain flared, sharp and humiliating. I stumbled, catching myself on the brass strip, my parchment crumpled in my grip. Witness unit, the enforcer said, voice low, comply. The confessor's voice remained calm, as if he were instructing children in a catechism. Contradiction, he preached, is heresy wearing a familiar face. It speaks in your own voice, it borrows your memories, it tells you that you are special enough to be correct when the archive is not. The congregation murmured again, like a sea of mouths swallowing the lesson. Read, the confessor repeated, and this time his tone hardened. Read and be freed of your burden. My knee throbbed. My ribs tightened as I fought the urge to vomit. The shrine air felt too thick to breathe. I could taste ash on my tongue. So I read, not because I believed it, not because I accepted it, but because I understood what refusal meant. Refusal meant the Hall of Frames. Refusal meant reconciliation. Refusal meant my own body becoming a resource and my silence being made permanent. I read the purified statement aloud, my voice shaking, each word scraping my throat like grit. The Vox grills caught it and amplified it, throwing my compliance back at me as if the shrine itself were mocking me. When I finished, the scribe stepped forward with a slate and indicated the signature line. "Sign," the scribe said. My hand hovered, trembling. The stylus felt heavy like a weapon. I thought of my first signature on the registration card, my child's shaking hand consenting to outcomes I could not understand. I thought of the audit room, the quill scratching, the folder full of signatures I had never made. I thought of the intake station in the reconciliation hall, the clerk's stamp striking over screams. This was the same act, repeated in different sanctuaries, the Imperium's favorite ritual, turning resistance into a mark on paper. I signed. The scribe stamped it immediately, and the stamp's impact echoed through my skull. Then the confessor lifted his staff and spoke a benediction that sounded like a sentence disguised as blessing. "Behold," he said, "the correction of the faithful. The archive is strengthened. The community is stabilized. The Emperor's truth endures." Behind us, the congregation erupted into applause, ragged, trembling claps that sounded less like celebration and more like desperate proof of loyalty. I watched faces in the crowd, eyes wide, mouths stretched into forced smiles, hands clapping too quickly. They were not applauding because they believed. They were applauding because they were afraid not to. Because in the hive, disbelief is not merely an internal state, it is an observable deviation. As the applause thundered, I felt something inside me curdle. It was not a loss of faith in the Imperium's power. I had never been foolish enough to doubt that. It was the collapse of the last childish notion that truth mattered to anyone in authority. The truth was not an objective thing, not a stable pillar. It was an administrative product, issued, revised, recalled, reissued, a ration like any other. I looked up at the towering Aquila and the rows of candles burning obediently, and I felt the shrine's true purpose settle over me like a shroud. It was not there to comfort the oppressed. It was there to teach us how to applaud our own erasure. When they dismissed us, we filed out in silence, the wax seals on our statements still warm in our hands. Outside, the hive's air was colder, dirtier, and somehow easier to breathe. The transit tunnels roared with the sound of machinery and distant horns. Life continued, because life is what happens between stamps. I returned to my bunk cubicle and tucked the purified statement into the crack behind my wall panel. Not because I wanted it, but because I understood that in this world, possession of the approved version is protection. If an enforcer asked what I had seen, I could produce the correct paper. I could show them my signature. I could show them my compliance. And somewhere deep inside, a smaller part of me, the part that had once been a person, whispered a question that felt like blasphemy. If the archive says the accident did not occur, if the shrine makes the city applaud that statement, if the missing are reconciled into quotas, then what am I who remembers otherwise? I lay down beneath the buzzing lumen strip and listened to the hive breathe through its vents. My knee throbbed. My mouth tasted of ash and metal. The purified statement pressed cold against my palm like a shackle. I did not pray. I did not dare. I only lay there, feeling the weight of an approved truth settling over the city like soot, and I understood that from this point forward, my fate would not be decided by what happened to me. It would be decided by what the Imperium was willing to record. War came for us the way everything else does, not as a dramatic arrival, but as an appended clause. It began with a notice nailed to the Hab Block's communal board, pinned beneath a curling poster that promised salvation through productivity. The paper was fresh, the ink still sharp, and the wax seal so new it looked wet. Around it, older notices sagged and yellowed, ration amendments, sanitation warnings, devotional schedules, but this one drew the eye the way a cut draws flies. Emergency redeployment, sector defense addendum, labor units reassigned to frontline support, compliance is duty. Duty is life. No mention of choice, no mention of fear. Just the neat, merciful lie that you were being redeployed, as if you were equipment being shifted to meet demand. The Shrine Precinct had already taught me, truth is what endures in the archive. This paper would endure. My body might not. They gathered us before dawn shift, when the hive's lumen strips still struggled to imitate morning. We stood in a transit bay that smelled of wet metal and old fuel, packed shoulder to shoulder, while an administratum functionary read our names, our codes, from a slate. A pair of enforcers stood behind him like punctuation marks, shock batons hanging at their belts with casual inevitability. The functionary's voice was bored, but the ritual was sacred. By production mandate and sector necessity, he droned, you are hereby reassigned to military labor support, classification expendable, term until concluded, as if wars end neatly, as if the hive ever releases what it has claimed. They shaved our heads at intake, not for hygiene, but for uniformity. Hair is individuality, individuality is deviation. A servitor with blunt clippers moved down the line, its hands steady, its face blank. My scalp stung under the cold bite of air afterward, and I felt strangely lighter, as if they had removed not only hair but some last remnant of civilian identity. They issued us uniforms that smelled of mildew and machine oil, and boots whose soles were already worn thin by previous owners. They gave us stamped tags to wear around our necks, metal rectangles that clicked against our sternums when we moved, each one etched with a code and a designation. Frontline labor asset. A priest blessed the tags with a quick splash of holy water that smelled suspiciously like industrial solvent. You are now part of the Emperor's shield, he proclaimed. Be grateful for the honor. Honor? The word tasted like rust. The transport down to the surface, if it was a surface in a hive, surface is relative, was a freight lift repurposed for bodies. We were packed into it until breathing became communal. The lift groaned as it descended through kilometers of steel and stone, and the air grew colder with each level, as if we were being lowered into a grave. When the doors finally opened, the smell hit us like a physical force. Mud, promethium, cordite, rot. It was not the hive's familiar stink of waste and sweat. This was open decay, uncontained, a stench that carried on wind. The air tasted of smoke and wet ash, and somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered with a slow, patient rhythm, boom, 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 like a giant stamping forms in the dark. They marched us across a staging yard where armored vehicles squatted like beasts, engines idling with a low growl. Servitors loaded crates of ammunition with mechanical indifference. Soldiers in stained flak armor moved among them, faces tight, eyes hollow. No one looked at us with pity. Pity is for those you still consider human. A commissarial clerk sat at a field desk beneath a canvas awning, stamping papers as we filed past. Each stamp was loud in the open air, a hard crack that cut through the distant artillery. The clerk did not look up. He only checked codes, marked tallies, and pressed ink into parchment as if the war itself were merely another ledger to be balanced. Next, he said again and again. The trenches waited beyond the yard, carved into the earth like wounds that refused to close. As we approached, the ground became a slurry of mud and crushed debris. My boots sank with each step, making obscene, sucking sounds as if the earth were trying to swallow us back. The trench walls were reinforced with plasteel sheets and rotting timbers, slick with moisture, scrawled with prayers and crude tally marks. Every few meters a candle guttered in a niche, its flame trembling in the damp air like a frightened soul. The sky above was not a sky. It was a lid, grey smoke layered on grey clouds, heavy enough to press on the shoulders. The sun, if it existed, was only a paler stain behind the haze. A sergeant shouted orders over the din, his voice raw. "You, labor assets, move, wire detail, fill the crater line, keep your heads down unless you want to donate them." We were given tools, shovels with cracked handles, coils of razor wire that bit into our gloves, sandbags that reeked of mold. Work, as always, was the Imperium's answer to fear. If your hands are busy, your mind has less room to scream. Shells fell with the steady patience of accounting. The first impact I felt in the trench was distant, a dull thump that made the mud tremble. Then another, closer, showering us with clods of wet earth and splinters of timber. The explosions did not come in frantic bursts. They came in measured intervals, like a clerk tapping a stamp. Here is one casualty, here is another, here is another. I saw a man on wire detail a few meters ahead of me take a fragment in the throat. It was not cinematic, it was ugly and fast. He clutched at his neck, eyes wide, blood pumping between his fingers in bright pulses that looked almost too vivid against the grey world. He tried to speak, perhaps to pray, perhaps to call a name, but all that came out was a wet bubbling. He collapsed into the mud, and the mud accepted him with a slow, greedy slurp. The sergeant didn't stop shouting. "Keep moving," he roared. "That's an administrative loss, don't make it two." Administrative loss. Even death had a category. A Medicaid team arrived later, their coats stained, their hands gloved. They didn't carry a stretcher, they carried a slate. One of them knelt by the dead man, checked his tag, and shook his head without emotion. "Record as," the Medicaid began. A commissarial clerk appeared as if summoned by the word record. He flipped through a small ledger, lips moving silently, then said, "Missing by administrative error." I stared at him, mud caked on my knees, my shovel handle slick in my grip. "He's right there," I blurted before I could stop myself. My voice sounded strange in the trench, too loud, too human. The clerk's eyes flicked to me, cold, irritated, like a man noticing a stain on his sleeve. "And yet," he said, tapping the ledger with his stylus, "he is not. Morale statistics require stability next." The Medicaid wrote it down, the clerk stamped it. The dead man's body remained in the mud for hours until night detail dragged it out to make room for the living. That was when I understood the battlefield addendum. War was not merely killing us, it was reclassifying us as it did. Men died twice here, once when the shell took them, and again when the paperwork declared a different outcome to preserve the narrative the Imperium needed. A casualty could become missing, a rout could become tactical withdrawal, a slaughter could become acceptable attrition, and because the archive was sacred, the archive would be believed. The mud could keep the rest. Nights in the trench were worse than days. In daylight, fear has at least the honesty of visibility. You see the smoke, the flashes, the silhouettes moving beyond the wire. At night, fear becomes intimate. The damp cold crawls into your bones. The trench stinks of urine and mildew and blood that never fully dries. Rats, fat, fearless things, skitter along the duckboards, their bodies brushing your boots. Somewhere, someone is always coughing, and each cough sounds like a countdown. The prayers never stop. Soldiers murmur litanies under their breath. A vox speaker crackles periodically with recorded hymns, tinny and distorted, praising sacrifice as if sacrifice were voluntary. "Endure," the voice says. "Endure, endure, endure." I tried to sleep with my back against the trench wall, my knees drawn up, my shovel beside me like a useless weapon. When I closed my eyes, I saw the reconciliation hall again, frames, straps, mist, scribes reading dispositions. Then I would open my eyes to the trench and realize the difference was only in method. Here, the saw was replaced by shrapnel, the injector by exhaustion. The stamp remained the same. On the third day, if it was the third, time in war is measured less by hours than by how long you've gone without screaming. We were ordered to fill a crater line. The crater was a bowl of mud and broken bodies. The earth churned so thoroughly it looked like meat minced for processing. We slid down into it, shovels biting into mud that smelled of promethium and decay. A shell landed close enough that the concussion knocked me flat. My ears rang, my mouth filled with grit. When my vision cleared, I saw a boy, no older than I had been at the registration counter, lying half submerged in mud, his eyes staring at nothing. His tag was still around his neck, bright metal against filth. His hands were curled as if still clutching an imaginary tool. A clerk leaned over the crater edge, shouting down, "Retrieve tags, leave bodies, tags are property, bodies are waste." The sentence made something inside me crack. Not loudly, not visibly, just a small internal fracture like bone hairlining under strain. The shrine had taught me to applaud my erasure. The audit had taught me to sign lies. The reconciliation hall had shown me bodies converted into output. And now the battlefield taught me this: even in death, you could be stripped down to what the Imperium valued, your identifier, your proof of assignment, while the rest of you was discarded as inconvenient mass. We worked until our hands blistered and our arms shook. We filled sandbags, we dragged wire, we hauled ammunition crates, we buried the dead shallowly when ordered, and left them where they fell when not. Above us, shells continued to fall with their patient rhythm, each one another stamp struck in the soil. I began to understand why I had survived the hive's corrections, not because I was lucky, not because I was clever, but because I was being moved toward a purpose I had never chosen. I was being preserved the way you preserve a tool, kept intact until it is needed, then used until it breaks. The sky remained a lid, the mud remained hungry, the ledger remained open. And in the moments between explosions, I felt the Imperium's will pressing down like weight, insisting that even death, even terror, even the final twitch of a human body in the mud must match the approved version. I survived the week not because I fought well, but because I learned to make myself small again. I learned to move when told, to keep my head down, to treat my own fear as irrelevant data. Because here on the front line, the outcome wasn't merely being watched, it was being written in advance, and I was just another line item waiting for its proper stamp. The summons found me the way shrapnel finds you, without malice, without hurry, with perfect inevitability. It was waiting at the trench admin desk after morning stand to, pinned beneath a slate board streaked with mud fingerprints and old blood. A courier servitor stood beside it, motionless, its chest plate smeared with wax where previous deliveries had been slapped into place. The servitor's eyes were dull glass, its mouth sewn into a permanent half-open obedience, and its hands were replaced with clamp tools that could hold paper as easily as they could hold a throat. My designation was printed in block script, my code crisp as a verdict. Around it, like warding runes, were seals, not one, not two, multiple, red wax in layered circles, each impression slightly offset, as if they feared a single authority might fail to bind me. I knew with a cold certainty that this was not simply an order. It was an end. The clerk behind the desk didn't look at me when he slid the summons across. He was busy stamping another sheet, his motions mechanical, his eyes dead from the fatigue of too many deaths made administrative. "Report," he said. "Immediate, no detours, no delays." His tone suggested this was for my benefit, like advice on keeping boots dry. I took the parchment and felt the wax seals through my gloves, hard ridges pressing into my palm like raised scars. The paper smelled of incense and damp, but beneath it was something else. That same faint sweetness of disinfectant that always came before the Imperium did something final to flesh. I walked. No one stopped me. No one asked questions. Even the sergeant, who usually barked at everything, simply watched me pass with a flicker of recognition and then looked away, as if witnessing my summons might infect him. On the battlefield, everyone understands the hierarchy of endings. Some end in mud, some end in a Medicaid tent. Some end in a ledger marked missing. This one, this sealed summons, belonged to a category no one wanted to share. The administrative bunker squatted half-buried in the churned earth behind the second line, reinforced with plasteel ribs and draped in camo netting that did nothing to hide its ugliness. A shrine icon had been bolted above the entrance. a crude aquila welded from scrap metal, its wings asymmetrical, as if even the symbol of the Imperium was being produced under emergency quotas. At the door, a guard in black carapace armor checked the seals, scanned my tag, and waved me inside with the same disinterest one might show a ration crate. The air within was warmer, drier, and saturated with paper. It shocked me how quickly the smell of war, promethium, cordite, rot, gave way to the smell of bureaucracy, wet parchment, ink, candle smoke, and the faint metallic tang of machine oil from the cogitator stacks. It was as if the Imperium had built a small hive within the war, a pocket of administrative purity where death could be processed into acceptable narratives. The corridor was narrow, lit by lumen strips that flickered like tired eyelids. My boots clicked on metal flooring instead of mud. The sound felt obscene, clean, precise, like a surgeon's tools laid out neatly while screams echoed beyond the wall. I was led into a room that could have been any room I'd ever been corrected in. Desk, chair, cogitator terminals, shelves of binders, a censer burning incense in dutiful quantities. The only difference was the faint vibration of distant artillery, like a heartbeat under the floor. Behind the desk sat an officer in a pressed uniform that looked too immaculate for the front line. His cap bore the marks of multiple departments, as if he had been authorized by several overlapping bureaucracies. His face was narrow and tired, his eyes the color of old paper. He did not smile, but his expression wasn't cruel either. It was worse than cruelty. It was polite. He gestured to the chair opposite him. I sat because the chair was there, because the room was built for sitting, because the act of sitting felt like accepting the premises of the conversation. My hands rested on my knees, fingers stiff inside gloves still stained with trench mud. I tried not to breathe too deeply. The incense made my throat itch. The officer opened a folder. The folder was thick, too thick to be about a single incident, too thick to be about a single mistake. It was the kind of thickness that comes from years of amendments, revisions, attachments, addenda, a life turned into paper and then reworked until the paper outweighed the life. He spoke my code, careful and precise, and then he spoke the phrase I had come to dread more than any threat: data contamination event. The word sounded clinical, as if he were diagnosing mold in a storeroom. You have, through repeated exposure to misaligned narrative events, he continued, demonstrated a persistent capacity for inconsistency with archived truth. My mouth went dry. I forced my voice steady. I complied. You have complied in form, he said, and I felt my stomach turn. Compliance in form is valuable. However, the record indicates continued risk of narrative instability. He flipped through pages. I caught glimpses of my own existence described in bureaucratic language. Audits performed, corrections issued, shrine purification completed, redeployment executed. My signature appeared again and again, a crooked mark that had become a brand. The officer's tone remained gentle, almost regretful, as if he were reading me a medical prognosis. Your continued existence in an unsupervised cognitive state constitutes a threat to continuity, he said. Continuity is stability. Stability is survival. This is not personal. Not personal. Nothing ever is when the machine eats you. He slid a document across the desk toward me. It was a single sheet, crisp and new, with the weight of many seals implied by the blank spaces where wax would soon be pressed. Disposition offer, corrective outcome selection option A, servitorization, salvage function allocation option B, disappearance, narrative instability containment. For a moment I simply stared, unable to make my eyes accept the words. Outside, artillery boomed again, the vibration passing through the room like distant thunder. The officer waited as if patience were part of the procedure. Disappearance? I managed. My voice sounded small in the stale air. What does that mean? The officer's eyes did not change. It means you will cease to exist in the record, he said, matter of fact. No further entries, no further questions, no further risk. My skin prickled. I thought of the men declared missing by administrative error while their bodies lay in mud. I thought of how easily paper could erase the physical. Disappearance was not a mystical vanishing. It was a bureaucratic act. A stamp, a sealed line, a person removed like an incorrect figure in a ledger. And servitorization? I asked, though I already knew. Everyone knows, even if they pretend not to. Servitors are everywhere, pushing carts, guarding doors, chanting litanies through vox grills while their eyes stare at nothing. The Imperium loves servitors because they are people corrected into usefulness. The officer leaned back slightly, as if preparing to offer reassurance. Servitorization is salvage, he said. Your body remains an asset, your function continues, your cognitive liability is contained. Contained, like a toxin in a sealed vial. My hands trembled. I tucked them beneath the edge of the desk so he wouldn't see. In the silence, I could hear the cogitator fans whining softly, moving stale air over circuits, keeping the machine alive. I thought of option B, disappearance, like stepping into a dark hallway and trusting there would be a flaw. No record, no trace, no one even allowed to remember you without risking contamination. It was a death without a body, a murder committed by ink. I thought of option A, servitorization, and my stomach churned with old images, frames, straps, sore arms, injectors, the smell of cauterized meat. But the officer's phrasing, salvage function, hung in my mind like bait. Salvage meant something remains. I realized with a sick clarity that I was still clinging to a superstition I'd carried since childhood, that awareness, however painful, was proof of existence, that if I could remember, I could in some way resist being fully rewritten. It was foolish, it was childish, it was the last shred of self I had left. I choose servitorization, I said. The words tasted like ash. My throat tightened as if trying to choke them back, but it was too late. Once spoken, they entered the air, and the air in an administratum room does not forget. The officer nodded almost approvingly, as if I had selected the correct answer on a form. Understood, he said. This decision will be recorded as voluntary compliance. Voluntary, the Imperium's favorite lie. He pressed a small button. The door behind me opened with a hydraulic sigh. 2 attendants entered, orderlies perhaps, but dressed in the pale smocks of Medicaid workers. Their faces were hidden behind respirators. They carried not weapons but equipment, restraints, injectors, a pair of clippers already humming softly like hungry insects. I tried to stand, not to flee, there was nowhere to flee, but simply because sitting felt too much like surrender. A hand pressed down on my shoulder, strong, efficient. I was guided back into the chair with the calm certainty of procedure. The officer spoke again, still polite. This will be quicker if you remain compliant, he said. You have done well in maintaining form. Continue. One of the attendants stepped behind me. The clippers touched my scalp, though it had already been shaved at redeployment, and began to scrape away what little stubble remained. The vibration ran through my skull. Loose hair fell onto my shoulders like black ash. The attendant's gloved fingers pressed my head slightly forward, exposing the back of my neck. Another attendant dabbed my skin with cold antiseptic. The scent was sharp, clean, and horrifyingly familiar. I swallowed, mouth dry. Will I remember? I asked before I could stop myself. The officer paused as if considering whether the question merited an answer. His gaze flicked to the folder, then back to me. Memory is not required for function, he said gently. If remnants remain, they will be irrelevant. Irrelevant, like screams in a reconciliation hall, like bodies in a trench, like truth outside the archive. A needle slid into my neck. Cold fluid burned through my veins. My limbs grew heavy. The room blurred at the edges, the lumen strips smearing into pale streaks. I heard my own breathing grow louder inside my ears, slow and thick. As my vision dimmed, I saw the officer reach for a stamp. He pressed it into red wax with careful deliberation, then lifted it and brought it down onto the document. Crack. The sound reverberated through my skull like a final judgment. I understood then the last cruelty. The moment I chose servitorization, I had not chosen survival. I had chosen the method of my erasure. The forms allowed no third box to tick, no space for let me remain myself, no category for I am human, only salvage or disappearance, only function or deletion. The attendants lifted me, my feet dragged slightly, the world swayed. The smell of incense and antiseptic fused into a single choking perfume. As they guided me out of the room, my last clear thought was not of the war, not of the hive, not even of the bodies in frames. It was of my hand, small, shaking, signing my first classification card as a child. I had consented then to being rewritten, because I didn't understand what outcomes meant. Now I understood, and I had signed anyway. They cut away my voice first. Not out of mercy. Mercy is not an approved material in the Imperium supply chain, but because voices travel. A voice can vibrate through vents, slip between doors, lodge itself in another mind and breed questions. Questions are contagion. Contagion becomes deviation. Deviation becomes paperwork. Paperwork becomes knives. So they began with silence, because silence is clean. I remember the corridor after the officer's stamp, like a sequence of damp lights and gentle hands that were not gentle. The attendants guided me down a passage lined with devotional plaques that praised purity through function. Each plaque was riveted into place with the same care as a restraining bolt. The lumen strips flickered above, making the world pulse, bright, dim, bright, like someone deciding whether I deserved to be seen. My boots dragged, my knees did not want to remember how to bend. The sedative burned in my veins like cold fire, numbing the edges of thought while leaving the core intact, a cruel preservation. I could still feel fear. I could still understand. I simply could not resist in any way that mattered. They brought me into a chamber that smelled like a shrine that had lost its god. Disinfectant over incense, chemical sharpness threaded through sacred sweetness. Underneath both the honest scent of flesh, warm, salty, and already resigned. The walls were tiled in pale ceramite, scrubbed so thoroughly they seemed to glow, and yet every grout line looked like it held stains that would never be forgiven. A censer burned in a corner, its smoke curling up toward a vent fan that chewed at it with mechanical indifference. Even holiness here was filtered. They laid me on a slab. It was not a bed. Beds imply rest. This was a platform, cold metal with shallow grooves to channel fluids. Restraints snapped shut around my wrists and ankles with the tidy click of administrative closure. Straps crossed my chest. Another strap tightened across my throat, not to choke me, but to keep my head aligned. Alignment is everything. Above me, an articulated arm hung from a ceiling rail. It held instruments, a scalpel, a cautery probe, a needle array, a clamp. The tools gleamed under the lumen glare, each one polished as if the act of cleaning could absolve the act of cutting. A priest stood to my right, his robe layered with cog-tooth symbols and stitched prayers. His face was hidden behind a mask of hammered metal shaped into a saint's skull. Tubes ran from the mask into a rebreather unit on his back, hissing softly with each inhale. I could not see his eyes, but I could feel the weight of his authority like pressure on my ribs. He spoke in a low chant, words slipping out in practiced cadence. Flesh is fallible, he intoned. Mind is mutable, function is eternal. By seal and sanction, by ordained correction, we excise instability, we preserve utility. We honor the emperor through obedience of matter. An attendant adjusted a tray beside my head. On it lay a small pile of wax seals, a stamp block, and, most obscene of all, a folder, my folder. Even here, even as my body was strapped down and my thoughts scrambled under sedative haze, the Imperium insisted on paperwork within arm's reach, as if the true patient was not me, but the record of me, as if my flesh was merely the medium through which the archive would complete itself. The attendant opened the folder and turned it so I could see. Pages. So many pages. I recognized some, even through the blur. My original registration card. The crooked signature of a frightened child. Correction notices neat and merciless. Audit transcripts stamped and initialed. Shrine statements bearing my compliance. Redeployment orders. Casualty ledger excerpts where my designation appeared as labor asset. Active. Each page carried seals. Each seal carried authority. And the stack was thick enough that the paper edges looked bruised, like skin after repeated strikes. My life's weight was not measured in years. It was measured in amendments. I tried to speak, to ask, what? For what purpose, when the purpose was already filed? My mouth opened, but my tongue felt foreign, heavy, like it had been wrapped in cloth. Only a faint sound escaped, a wet exhale. The priest turned his skull mask slightly toward me. Vocalization is no longer required, he said, and there was no cruelty in his tone, only the calm certainty of policy. The sealing arm moved. A clamp descended toward my jaw. It touched my lower lip with cold metal, then pressed gently, forcing my mouth open in a fixed, obedient gape. A second instrument slid in, and I felt the pressure at the back of my throat. Panic flared, not clean fear, but animal fear, hot and immediate. I wanted to thrash, the straps held. I wanted to bite, the clamp held. I wanted to scream. The instrument was already there, already negotiating my anatomy, as if consulting a diagram rather than a living body. The needle array hissed. A sharp prick, then another. Numbing agent poured into soft tissue. My tongue went numb, my gums burned. The world narrowed to sensation, the taste of antiseptic, the sting of injection, the buzzing of lumen lights, the distant rumble of artillery outside the bunker, like a reminder that even this horror was merely part of a larger process. Then the cutting began, not loud, not dramatic, just the soft, wet sounds of surgery, the snip, the scrape, the faint crackle of cautery. I felt pressure more than pain. The sedative dulled the edges, but it could not erase awareness. The worst part was knowing what was being taken, not a limb, not an eye, but expression. The ability to form words, the ability to turn thought into sound. The Imperium does not fear what you feel, it fears what you can spread. When they finished, the clamp withdrew. Warmth pooled at the back of my throat. The priest dabbed it away with a cloth that smelled of incense and old iron. He murmured a prayer that sounded like a production blessing. Speech is a privilege of the stable, he said. Silence is the garment of the useful. An attendant leaned in close. I saw their eyes through the mask lenses, tired, not unkind, and utterly resigned. They held up a small metal disc stamped with my designation and a new suffix. Servitor grade, salvage function, cognitive liability. Contained the disc was fixed to my collar with a rivet gun. The impact jolted my neck. I felt the cold weight settle against my skin. Then came the next step, the rewriting of the inside. They rolled my head to one side and shaved the back of my skull again, though there was little left to shave. Cold antiseptic smeared across my scalp. The smell was so sharp it cut through everything, even incense. A drill whined to life, high, thin, like a screaming insect, and I tried to close my eyes, but my eyelids were taped open, a strip of adhesive pulling at the delicate skin like a tiny cruelty. The drill touched bone. Vibration ran through my skull, a pressure that felt like a headache becoming physical. My mind tried to retreat, tried to collapse inward into darkness, but the drugs kept me hovering at the surface, forced to witness. The priest began to chant again, louder this time. His words were not for comfort, they were for permission. Litanies that sanctified the act, that framed violation as devotion. By writ and seal, he intoned, the archive completes its circuit. By ordained correction, the outcome is stabilized. An augmetic plug slid into the new socket in my skull with a soft, intimate click, and then something touched my mind. Not like a thought, like a hand, a cold pressure behind the eyes, a sensation of being indexed, of invisible fingers flipping through the pages of me, searching for inconsistencies, for stray sparks of unapproved recollection, for the stubborn remnants of a person who had once believed memory could be hidden in a wall. Images rose without my consent. The administratum counter, brass grill, the clerk's augmetic eyes. The correction notice, red wax seal, words insisting the accident did not occur. The audit room, quill scratching, baton pain. The reconciliation hall, frames and straps and Carter's eyes. The shrine, applause like desperate rainfall. The trench, mud swallowing bodies while clerks stamped missing. Each image appeared as if projected, then shuddered, flickered, like footage being reviewed and edited. I felt a tugging sensation at each memory's edges, as if someone were trimming it to fit a template. Certain details dimmed, the sound of the hoist snapping softened. The smell of cauterized meat dulled. Carter's mouth forming my name blurred, then vanished like a smudge wiped from glass. I tried to hold on to her. I tried to hold on to my name. But the system did not argue. It did not negotiate. It simply applied correction, the way pressure applied long enough will reshape soft metal. A voice, not spoken aloud, but present inside my skull like a stamped directive, pulsed in time with the machinery. Outcome confirmed, inconsistency resolved, function prioritized. I wept then, silently, because I could not do anything else. Tears leaked from the corners of my eyes and ran into my hairline, cold tracks that felt almost cleansing until I remembered they were only fluids, only waste. The priest watched my tears and seemed satisfied, as if emotional discharge was merely another stage of processing. He turned to the folder and closed it with deliberate care. The sound of it shutting was loud in my head, a final thump like a coffin lid. He took a stamp block, pressed it into a pool of red wax and brought it down on the folder's cover. Crack. The seal cooled quickly, hardening into certainty. Final revision completed, he said. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. I wanted to beg. But all I could do was breathe through my nose and stare at the lumen glare until it turned into halos. They unstrapped me. My limbs did not move correctly at first. The attendants lifted me upright, and I swayed, my balance uncertain as if my body no longer trusted its own commands. A servitor harness was fastened around my torso, rigid straps and metal brackets, connecting me to a cart of equipment. The cart's weight pulled at my shoulders, anchoring me to my new purpose. As they guided me out of the chamber, I caught a glimpse of myself in a reflective panel, a shaved head, wide, forced open eyes, a collar tag stamped with function, my mouth slack, lips pale, jawline marked by fresh bruising. There was recognition there, faint and sick, like seeing your own corpse and realizing it still breathes. I understood then the final cruelty of the Imperium's rewriting. They did not grant me the mercy of total deletion. They left me alive enough to remember the sensation of losing everything, but powerless enough to ever speak it. They turned my despair into an approved template, filed it under contained liability, and set me to work. Now I am moved through corridors again, pushing carts, carrying forms, delivering sealed notices. I see clerks stamping outcomes that have not yet happened. I see scribes reading revised dispositions over bodies that still twitch. I see citizens applaud statements that erase their neighbors. My eyes record, my hands obey. My mind, what remains of it, drifts in the narrow channels carved for it. Sometimes, in the quiet between tasks, a fragment surfaces, the smell of wet parchment, the feel of a graphite stub in a child's hand, the shape of a name on someone's lips. The system notices. A cold pressure pulses behind my eyes. Irrelevant, corrected, continue. So I continue. If anyone ever asks what truly happened, the archive will answer for me. The archive will declare the approved version with perfect confidence. And I, still here, still moving, still trapped behind silence, will remain the one thing the Imperium cannot fully erase, a living instrument, forced to remember just enough to suffer, and corrected forever into usefulness. Do you want me to continue with the next chapter?